The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon when the boy rode into the rancher's view. No more than 10, his face was streaked with dirt, and his wide eyes were filled with desperation. He was gripping the reins of the mule tightly, as if his very life depended on it. His tiny frame seemed lost against the large animal's bulk, but there was an urgency in his every movement. Dust kicked up around them as they made their way along the long stretch of gravel road leading to the rancher's cabin. Each step the mule took seemed heavier than the last, and the boy's breath came in sharp, jagged bursts. From the porch of his cabin, the rancher noticed the boy and the mule slowly making their way up the path. He was a young man, around 30, his face weathered by years of toil under the unforgiving sun. His hands were calloused and rough, worn from years of labor. He had seen many things in his life, but this child, alone, wild-eyed, and clearly in distress, was unlike anything he had encountered in recent years. The boy's words shattered the silence between them as he pulled the mule to a stop in front of the porch. His voice was raw, shaky, but filled with the kind of urgency that immediately caught the rancher's attention. "Please help. My mama's still breathing." The boy's chest heaved with each gasp for air, and his eyes were locked onto the rancher's, pleading for something the rancher couldn't quite place. The rancher took a cautious step forward, his expression a mix of concern and skepticism. "Easy now, son," he said, his voice gruff from years of hard work. "What's happened? Where's your mama?" He reached out a hand to the boy, trying to offer some semblance of comfort, but the boy didn't seem to notice. His mind was focused on one thing only: getting help. The rancher could see the boy was trembling. His clothes were torn, his face pale and streaked with exhaustion. But there was no time to dwell on those details. The rancher's mind began to race as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He knew people sometimes found themselves in difficult situations, but this felt different. There was something desperate, something more urgent about the boy's plea. "Get off the mule," the rancher said firmly, as the boy remained frozen on the animal's back, clutching the reins with white knuckles. The rancher's voice softened. "Come on, I'll help you. Show me what's going on." The boy didn't need to be told twice. He slid off the mule, his legs unsteady as if they hadn't borne weight in far too long. The rancher watched him for a moment before following him to the back of the wagon hitched to the mule. It wasn't a grand wagon, old, battered, and worn, but the boy treated it as if it was the only thing keeping his world together. As the boy moved to the back of the wagon, the rancher's eyes shifted over to what lay there. The moment he saw the woman, he froze. A thin, ragged figure lay unconscious in the wagon, her body curled into itself in a way that suggested she had fought to stay awake but had finally lost the battle. Her hair, dark and matted, fell across her face in tangled strands. The rancher could see the blood stains on her dress and the bruises that covered much of her exposed skin. She looked like someone who had been through a storm, someone who had survived it, but barely. The rancher didn't move right away. His eyes flickered between the woman and the boy, his mind trying to piece together what was happening. He had seen injuries like this before, in the aftermath of accidents or fights, but never from a child dragging an injured woman across the wilderness. The boy was standing beside him now, staring at the woman with a kind of helpless longing. "She's my mama," he said quietly, his voice breaking as he spoke. "She's all I have left. Please help her." The rancher finally moved. He knelt beside Elsie, his weathered hands carefully feeling for a pulse. His heart sank as he found it, faint but steady. He breathed a sigh of relief. The woman was alive, but she wasn't out of danger by any means. "Don't worry, son," the rancher said, trying to reassure the boy. "We'll get her inside. I'll do what I can." He looked up at the boy, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But we need to talk first. Where did you come from?" The boy's gaze shifted to the ground. "We live out by the river," he muttered. "Just us. We've been out there, but they came for her. They took her and I." The rancher held up a hand to stop the boy. He was trying to piece things together. But the urgency of the situation didn't allow for many questions. Instead, he motioned to the cabin. "Come on," he said, his voice firm. "We'll talk later. Right now, we need to get your mama inside." The boy nodded, not questioning the rancher's instructions. His focus was solely on Elsie, and his trust in the rancher seemed to come naturally. Inside the cabin, the rancher moved swiftly, pulling a blanket from the bed and laying it on the floor. The boy stayed close to Elsie, kneeling by her side as the rancher worked, his hands swift and sure despite the circumstances. The rancher wasn't sure how much time they had, but he knew that if Elsie didn't wake soon, things could take a turn for the worse. As the rancher worked, his mind continued to churn with questions he couldn't yet answer. Where had the boy come from? Why was Elsie in such a state? And what had she been running from? The boy's quiet sobs were the only sound in the room as the rancher set to work, his mind distracted. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew enough to stabilize someone in the short term. His hands moved with purpose, but his mind kept returning to the boy's words. They came for her. Who were they? And why they left Elsie to die alone on the outskirts of town? The boy didn't say much more. His gaze was focused on Elsie, who remained unconscious, her breathing steady but shallow. It wasn't until the boy leaned in, his small hands gently holding her hand, that the rancher began to understand just how deep their bond ran. This wasn't just a woman the boy had stumbled upon in the woods. This was his mother, his protector, and his world. As the rancher sat back on his heels, he glanced out the window, his thoughts turning to his own family, to the things he had left behind. The boy's quiet words stirred something deep inside him, a memory of a past that he hadn't thought about in years. A past filled with secrets, struggles, and choices that couldn't be undone. Elsie's history, however, remained hidden behind the bruises and dirt. There was more to her than met the eye, something the rancher couldn't yet put his finger on. Her connection to this land, to the rancher's own history, was something he felt in his gut but couldn't explain. She was no stranger to hardship, that much was clear. But what had brought her here? Why had she been running? The boy's quiet voice interrupted the rancher's thoughts. "She never talks about her past," the boy said, his eyes never leaving Elsie's face. "She only tells me to keep quiet and stay out of trouble. But I think she's been running for a long time." He paused, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't want to lose her. Not like this." The rancher took a deep breath. There was more to this than just an injured woman and a desperate boy. But for now, all he could do was wait and hope that Elsie would wake up to tell her own story. The rancher stood in the cabin's small, dimly lit room, his hands trembling slightly as he worked to patch up Elsie's wounds. She lay on the floor, pale and unconscious, the bloodstains on her dress a grim reminder of the violence she had endured. The boy hovered nearby, not speaking, but watching his mother with eyes full of fear and a silent desperation that gripped at the rancher's heart. It wasn't the first time he'd seen someone in need of help. He'd witnessed enough pain, tragedy, and death in his lifetime to know when it was better to stay away. Helping wasn't always a simple choice, and sometimes it only led to more trouble. He glanced at the boy, his face drawn with worry, clutching the small wooden horse in his hand as if it were the only thing that kept him anchored. The rancher felt the weight of his indecision. He could feel the pressure in his chest, the old scars of his past, making the decision harder than it should be. Helping meant involving himself in something he didn't fully understand. It could mean danger, more pain, or worse yet, more loss. The boy's voice broke the silence, thin and strained. "Please, she's all I have left." His words were more than a plea. They were the raw truth of a child who had already seen too much, who had already lost more than he should ever have to. The rancher's heart clenched at the sight of the boy's hopelessness. The rancher swallowed, his mouth dry. The reluctance in him slowly faded, replaced by something else. A sense of duty, maybe, or perhaps just a simple compassion for someone who needed help. The boy wasn't asking for much, and his mother was still breathing. That was enough. "I'll take her inside," the rancher said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying a trace of uncertainty. But we need to work fast. He paused, looking down at the boy. You can help me, son. Stay close, all right? The boy nodded, his hand shaking as he wiped his eyes, unable to keep the tears from falling. He had no words left, but his presence beside the rancher spoke volumes. As the rancher carefully helped move Elsie inside, the cabin's dim light seemed to grow darker with each passing moment. The boy stayed close, his small hand clutched tightly to the rancher's sleeve as they laid Elsie down on the cot. The rancher worked quickly, wiping the blood away and doing his best to stabilize her. His mind raced with questions. Who had done this to her? Why was she alone with just the boy? And what was the real story behind this woman, whose life seemed to have been shaped by something far darker than a simple injury? Elsie's breathing grew shallow, and for a moment, the rancher feared she might slip away before he could do anything to help. But then, just as he was about to examine her again, her eyelids fluttered open, and she let out a soft, pained groan. The rancher froze, his hands paused in midair, unsure what to do next. The boy's eyes widened as he leaned in, whispering, "Mama." Elsie's eyes met the boy's, but they were clouded with confusion. Her lips moved, but the words came out in a low, incoherent mumble. I didn't know." Her voice trailed off as if speaking required more energy than she could summon. The rancher stepped back, watching as the boy moved closer to his mother, his small hands touching her arm as he whispered comforting words. But it wasn't enough. Elsie's mind was somewhere else, tangled in a maze of memories and fears. There were flashes of something, faces, places, but it was hard to make sense of them. Elsie, the rancher muttered, almost to himself. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. Had he known her before? Had she crossed his path somewhere along the way? There was something about her that stirred a memory deep within him, something buried, something he had left behind a long time ago. But he couldn't hold on to it long enough to figure it out. Elsie's eyes darted around the room, scanning the walls, the faces of the boy and the rancher, as though trying to make sense of her surroundings. Her breathing hitched, and she winced in pain. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. I couldn't." The rancher knelt beside her, his rough hand brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "You're safe now," he said softly. "Rest. We'll get you back on your feet." But Elsie didn't respond. Her eyes fluttered closed again, and her head fell back against the pillow. The boy watched helplessly, his small hands still gripping hers, his face full of silent concern. As the rancher worked to tend to her injuries, the fragments of her past started to slip through, each piece harder to catch than the last. There was a story here, something she wasn't ready to tell, something dangerous. But he couldn't force her to speak. Not yet. For now, all he could do was wait and hope that when she woke again, she'd be able to explain everything. The boy sat beside his mother, his eyes fixed on her face as the rancher worked. He said little, only occasionally wiping his eyes, though he refused to leave her side. His silence spoke volumes. He didn't need to say anything. His fear was enough to make the rancher understand. He wasn't just worried about his mother's life. He was scared of losing her. He was scared of losing the last person who had ever cared for him. The rancher glanced at the boy every so often, noticing how the child's hands trembled as he reached for his mother's hand. There was something deeply heartbreaking about the way the boy clung to her, his small fingers wrapped around her wrist as though he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. It was as if he had been alone for so long that the thought of losing her was more than he could bear. "She's always been strong," the boy said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "She promised me she'd never leave. Please, don't let her leave me." His words were a quiet plea, a desperate whisper that tugged at the rancher's heart. The boy believed with everything he had that his mother would survive. And the rancher could see it in the boy's eyes, the unwavering belief that no matter what, Elsie would pull through. The rancher nodded, his throat tight. "We'll do everything we can, son," he said, trying to offer some reassurance. But deep down, he wasn't sure. He wasn't sure that they could save her. He wasn't sure where she had been running from or how much longer she had to fight. But the boy's faith in her was something the rancher couldn't deny. It was pure, untainted by the cruelty of the world. As the boy continued to watch his mother, the rancher felt the weight of the moment settle around them like a heavy blanket. They were strangers, bound together by a single moment of tragedy. The boy's attachment to his mother, though, was something deep and unshakable. And in that moment, the rancher knew that whatever came next, he would do everything in his power to help them both, no matter what secrets lay hidden in Elsie's past. As the day turned to night, the rancher sat in the corner of the cabin, watching over them both. Elsie slept, her breath steady but shallow. The boy, still clutching her hand, had fallen asleep beside her, his head resting on her arm. The silence in the cabin was heavy, filled with the weight of unanswered questions and uncertain futures. But for now, the rancher knew that the only thing he could offer them was shelter and the chance to heal. The bond between the boy and the rancher was only just beginning, but the journey ahead would change them both forever. The boy had already lost so much, and Elsie, whatever her past might hold, was about to face her own reckoning. As the days passed, Elsie's condition slowly began to improve. The rancher had done what he could to tend to her wounds, and now, as the fever began to fade, so did the veil of unconsciousness that had kept her from truly seeing the world around her. She started to regain strength, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet turmoil, that made the rancher uneasy. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about her seemed familiar. The rancher sat at the table in the corner of the cabin, sharpening a knife, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept catching glimpses of Elsie, her posture, the way she held herself even as she sat still in the chair, her gaze distant as if lost in thought. Her voice, when she spoke to the boy, was soft but laced with something he couldn't define, something he had heard before. The rancher's hand paused mid-motion, the knife's edge catching the dim light as his thoughts began to whirl. There was something about her scars, small, faded marks that no one would notice unless they were looking carefully, that tugged at something deep inside him. Her hands, though delicate, were rough, as though they had worked for years in the fields, much like his own had. And then there were the subtle things, the way her eyes darted to the door every time a breeze moved it, as if she were waiting for someone to burst in, or the way she reacted to the smallest noises, her body tensing, ready to run. "I've seen that look before," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. His voice was rough, as though the words had come from a place he had buried long ago. He didn't say anything more, but the boy noticed, and the silence between them grew heavier. The rancher's mind drifted back to a time, several years ago, when he was a younger man, filled with different hopes, and a life before the land had claimed so much of his soul. He couldn't remember the details clearly. Faces blurred, names faded, but there was something about the way Elsie reacted to the world that had once been his too. The rancher felt a stirring in his gut, a familiarity that grew more unsettling with each passing day. Had they crossed paths before? Had he known her from a life long lost? He couldn't answer the questions, but they gnawed at him, whispering through his thoughts like the wind through the cracks in the cabin walls. Elsie lay in the small bed, her eyes closed tightly, as if trying to force the memories back into place. She had started to regain consciousness fully, but each morning she woke, she seemed to remember less than the day before. Her head hurt, and the scars on her arms and legs burned with every movement, but it wasn't the pain that plagued her. It was the fragments of her past, scattered and disjointed, that seemed to be slipping further away with each passing hour. She could feel them, just beyond her reach, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't put the pieces together. She would try to focus on the sounds of the birds outside, the scent of the earth after a rain, but the images kept slipping through her fingers. A man's face, a cold, cruel gaze, the sound of footsteps that never seemed to stop following her. She had been running for so long that the chase had become a part of her. But where was she running to? Why had she kept going, only to end up here, in this small cabin on the outskirts of nowhere, with a boy who barely knew her name? I can't remember everything, but I know I've been here before. Elsie whispered to herself one morning, staring out the small window. The words were barely audible, but they hung heavy in the air. Her hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the blanket. She could feel the rancher's presence in the room, could hear the boy moving about, but for a moment, she was lost in the memories of a past that didn't quite fit together. It wasn't the first time she'd had such a thought, but each time it happened, it filled her with more dread. What if she wasn't meant to be here? What if she had come to this place for reasons she could no longer remember, only to find herself tangled in the consequences of her own past? The boy had been sitting quietly by her side, watching her with wide, uncertain eyes. He had always been a quiet child, but since the incident, he seemed to be even more withdrawn, as though something had broken inside him. Elsie noticed the way he held her hand with the same careful attention that he had when she was unconscious. It was a silent comfort, a reassurance that she hadn't lost him. But then, one evening, as she lay resting, the boy spoke up. His voice, small and unsure, broke through the silence that had hung between them for days. "Who were you running from, Mama?" he asked, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. Elsie's breath caught in her chest. The question, simple and straightforward, hit her like a wave. She had been running, yes, but what had she been running from? She couldn't even remember the details clearly. The memories of her past were like fragments of glass, sharp and dangerous, but impossible to piece back together. She hesitated for a moment, her thoughts racing. The boy's question was a reminder of all that she had been trying to forget. A reminder that, even in the safety of this cabin, her past had followed her. I don't want you to worry, son," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I made a lot of mistakes. A lot of things happened that I can't change." The boy didn't let go of her hand. He didn't say anything more, but his silent presence spoke volumes. He was waiting for answers, waiting for the truth, but Elsie didn't have the words. Not yet. The rancher, who had been standing at the doorway, watching quietly, felt the weight of the moment. He had seen so much of the boy's fear reflected in Elsie's eyes. He had seen in the way she flinched whenever the wind knocked against the cabin, the way she reacted when the boy spoke of their past. There was something buried deep inside her, something she wasn't ready to face, or maybe something she couldn't. The silence between them deepened, and the boy, sensing the unease, finally pulled his hand back, his eyes drifting down to the floor. Elsie, too, felt a deep ache in her chest, as though the question had opened a door she wasn't sure she wanted to walk through. The past she had been running from was catching up with her, and she couldn't escape it any longer. As the rancher moved away from the door, he muttered to himself, "There's something about her, something I don't understand." He had been watching her carefully, trying to piece together the bits of her story that didn't quite fit. There was more to her than just the scars, more than just the woman who had appeared on his doorstep one day with a boy and a desperate plea for help. And in that moment, the rancher realized that the answers Elsie was searching for might also be the answers he had been avoiding for years. The pieces of their past, his and hers, were finally starting to fall into place. But whether those pieces would lead to healing or more pain, neither of them was ready to find out. The sun had barely started to dip below the horizon when the rancher found himself alone on the porch, staring out at the fields. The day had been long, and there was still work to be done, but his mind refused to focus on the tasks that lay ahead. Elsie's presence in the cabin, her whispered words, and the boy's quiet fear echoed through his thoughts, pulling him into a place he hadn't visited in years. The past that he had buried so deep was suddenly rising to the surface. and there was no way to ignore it any longer. The rancher sat back in his chair, his hands resting on his knees as his mind wandered back to a time long ago. It wasn't just Elsie's scars or the way she held herself that made him uneasy. It was the familiarity in her eyes, the connection between them that no amount of time had been able to erase. He closed his eyes for a moment, and the memories flooded him like a wave. The rancher remembered the summer when everything had been different. He was a young man, in his early 20s, just starting out, full of hope and dreams for the future. The land had been good to him then, and life had seemed so simple. That was when he had first met Elsie. She had been a young woman, full of fire and spirit, with a laugh that could light up the darkest days. It had been a brief but intense connection, one that had changed everything for him. They had spent long afternoons together, talking, laughing, sharing everything that mattered. At first, it had been just another summer romance, the kind of thing that came and went without much thought. But it hadn't been that simple. They had quickly fallen in love, drawn together by something neither of them had expected. Their love had been quiet but deep, rooted in the shared understanding of the world around them, of the land, and of the hardships they both knew too well. They had made plans together, talked about a future that seemed so certain, so full of promise. But life had a way of tearing things apart. Elsie had disappeared one day, without a word, without a trace. No explanation, no goodbye, just a sudden absence that left the rancher with nothing but questions. The memories of that time were bittersweet, full of love and longing, but marred by the ache of loss. Elsie had been a part of his life, and then, without warning, she had vanished from it completely. For years, the rancher had convinced himself that it was better that way, that he was better off without her. But now, as he sat on the porch, watching the night settle in around him, he realized that the wound she had left never truly healed. And now, with her back in his life, the memories were resurfacing, and the emotions he had buried so long ago were threatening to overwhelm him. The rancher shook his head, trying to push the memories aside. There were more pressing matters at hand. Elsie's return had stirred up something deeper, something that could put them all at risk. The rancher stood up abruptly, his boots scraping against the wooden floor of the porch. He needed to think, to make a plan. Elsie's past, whatever it was, had come back to haunt them. And if they didn't confront it now, it would follow them wherever they went, threatening the fragile peace they had found. He walked back into the cabin, the door creaking behind him. Elsie was sitting by the fire, the boy asleep at her side. She looked tired, worn, but there was something about her, something in the way she held herself that made it clear she was far from the woman he remembered. She had been running for a long time, hiding from something or someone, and now she had brought that danger with her. The rancher moved closer to her, his voice low but firm. "You should have told me the truth, Elsie," he said, his words heavy with frustration. "If we don't deal with this now, it'll follow us wherever we go." He couldn't keep the fear from creeping into his voice. The thought of something or someone coming for them, coming for the boy, was a thought he couldn't bear. Elsie's eyes met his, her gaze filled with a mixture of pain and regret. "I didn't want to drag you into it," she whispered. "I thought I could protect him, protect us." The rancher paced back and forth, trying to make sense of everything. The boy, the woman, there was so much at stake. "You can't protect him alone, Elsie," he said, his voice rising. "You think I don't understand what you've been through? I've seen it. I've lived through it." He stopped and turned to face her. "But you can't keep running. Not anymore." Elsie stood up, her movement slow but determined. "I don't want to run anymore," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't go back. I can't face them again." The rancher's heart sank as he realized the depth of her fear. Whoever these people were, whoever had been chasing her, they had left scars on Elsie that ran deeper than the wounds on her body. He had seen the way she tensed at every sound, the way her eyes darted to the door when the wind shifted. She was terrified, and with good reason. And now the boy, her son, was caught in the middle of it. "We have to deal with this," the rancher said, his voice quiet but steady. "We can't keep hiding from whatever's coming. I'll help you, Elsie, but you have to trust me. We have to face it together." Elsie nodded, though there was doubt in her eyes. She wanted to trust him, but the fear was too deep. The past had a way of creeping up on you, and no matter how hard you tried, it was always there, waiting. As the night wore on, the rancher and Elsie sat by the fire, speaking in quiet tones. The boy remained asleep, his small body curled up next to his mother. The cabin was still, the only sound the occasional crackle of the fire and the wind howling outside. The rancher couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. That danger was closer than they realized. He stood up, the tension in his body evident. He had to protect them, but he didn't know what they were up against. Elsie's past was clouded with uncertainty, and the more she spoke about it, the more the rancher realized that he wasn't just protecting the boy and Elsie. He was protecting himself, too. "We need to prepare," the rancher said, his voice calm but resolute. "I'll make sure the doors are locked, and we'll move the supplies to the cellar. If it comes to a fight, we'll be ready." Elsie looked at him, her face etched with worry. "What if they come for us? What if we can't hide anymore?" The rancher placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "We'll face it, Elsie. Together." And for the first time since she had arrived, Elsie allowed herself to believe him. The air was still as the rancher stood on the porch, his eyes scanning the horizon. The day had begun like any other, calm and quiet. But something had shifted. He could feel it in his bones, the kind of tension that builds when you know trouble is headed your way. He didn't know when exactly, but the moment was coming. The storm was about to hit. It started with the sound of hooves in the distance, a steady clip-clop against the earth that was unmistakable. The rancher's gut tightened as he recognized the rhythm. There was something about it, the way the sound didn't belong in the stillness of the land. His instincts kicked in, and he moved swiftly toward the barn, his eyes darting toward the dusty road leading up to his home. The boy, who had been playing near the cabin, stopped and looked up, sensing the shift in the air. Within minutes, the rancher could see them. For men on horseback, their faces set and hard. They rode in with a purpose, as if they had been hunting for a long time, and now they had found what they were looking for. The rancher's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the gate. His hand went to the rifle he kept by the door, fingers brushing against the smooth wood, but he didn't take it yet. He wasn't sure who they were or what they wanted, but he could feel the danger in the air. It wasn't good. As the men dismounted, one of them stepped forward, his eyes dark and calculating. The rancher held his ground, his face hard, his jaw set. "She's been hiding too long," the man said, his voice cold and commanding. "It's time she comes back where she belongs." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. The rancher's heart skipped a beat. He knew immediately who they were talking about, Elsie. His instincts had been right. This was no chance encounter. These men were from her past, and their presence here wasn't a coincidence. The rancher stepped forward, keeping his posture relaxed, though every muscle in his body was coiled tight. "I don't know what you want, but you're not getting it here," he said firmly. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of someone who had been through enough to know when to stand his ground. The man's eyes flicked to the boy, who had come to stand beside the rancher, his small frame tense and unsure. The man smirked, his gaze shifting back to the rancher. "We've been looking for her for a long time," he said. "She's not safe here. We've come to bring her back." The rancher's blood ran cold. He could see the look in the man's eyes, the same hunger that comes with a man who is used to getting what he wants, no matter the cost. And it was clear that these men didn't care who they had to hurt to get Elsie back. He stepped closer to them, his voice lowering, but no less forceful. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said. "You're not welcome here. I suggest you turn around and leave." For a moment, there was silence between them, the tension thick and heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The rancher stood tall, unwavering, refusing to back down. The man sneered, taking a step forward. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he growled. "We've got business with her, and you'd better step aside if you want to keep things peaceful." The rancher's hand went to the rifle at his side, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. He knew better than to start a fight without knowing how it would end. But he wasn't about to let these men take Elsie. He would die before he let them hurt her, or the boy. Elsie stood in the doorway, having heard the commotion outside. She had been preparing supper, but the tension in the air was enough to draw her attention. The moment she saw the men, the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. She stepped back, away from the door, but her eyes never left them. The rancher turned to her, his voice softer now, but no less determined. "Stay inside, Elsie," he said, his eyes never leaving the men. "It's not safe out here." But Elsie didn't move. She was still, her hands clenched by her sides, as if trying to summon the strength to do something she wasn't ready for. The rancher could see the fear on her face, but also something else, something that told him she wasn't going to run anymore. Not from these men, not from her past. "I'm not going anywhere," the rancher said, his voice calm but resolute. "Not while these men are here. You're staying with me." The tension in the air thickened as the men moved closer, their faces filled with contempt. The rancher took another step forward, his stance firm. He was no longer just defending his land. He was defending Elsie, the boy, and everything he had built here. There was no going back. One of the men muttered under his breath, but the rancher didn't flinch. Instead, he stood taller, his eyes locked on the man who had spoken. "I'll fight to keep them safe," he said, his voice unwavering. "And if you think you can take them from me, you're wrong." The men exchanged uneasy glances. The rancher could see the doubt flickering in their eyes, but they didn't back down. They knew the power of fear, and they were counting on it to get what they wanted. But the rancher wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The boy stepped up beside him, his small frame brave, but his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, don't hurt my mama," he said, his voice trembling with a fear that cut straight to the rancher's heart. Elsie's eyes softened, her heart breaking as she knelt beside her son. "I won't let them hurt you," she said, her voice steady. "But I need to face them." The rancher looked at her, a mixture of confusion and concern in his eyes. He hadn't expected this. He had hoped to protect her, to keep her hidden from the dangers of her past. But Elsie's determination was clear. She wasn't going to run anymore. She was going to confront the demons that had been chasing her for so long. Elsie stood up, her face set in determination as she walked towards the men. Her decision was made. She couldn't keep running. She had been running for years, hiding from the people who had torn apart her life, but no more. "This is my fight too," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that crept in around the edges. "I can't keep running." The rancher stepped forward, his hand reaching for her, but she pulled away. "No, I made my choice. This is something I have to do." Elsie turned to face the men, her back straight, her eyes fierce. The boy's small hand reached out for her, but she didn't look back. She had to face this, for him and for herself. She had to stop running. The rancher watched her, a deep sadness settling in his chest. He knew this was something she had to do, but it didn't make it any easier. He had grown to care for her, to care for the boy, but he knew she had her own battle to fight. "I'll be here," the rancher said, his voice soft but firm. "Whatever happens, I'm with you." Elsie nodded, her eyes never leaving the men. She was ready. This time, she wouldn't run. This time, she would fight. The tension between them was palpable, but for the first time in a long time, Elsie was standing on her own. The rancher had given her the strength she needed to face her past, and now she was ready to confront the people who had caused her so much pain. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be the first step toward finding peace. The showdown had come. The chase was over. And now, Elsie would finally face where she had been running from for so long. The day had arrived. The air was thick with tension, and the rancher could feel it in his bones. The showdown was inevitable. Elsie's past had finally caught up to them, and now, the rancher and Elsie stood side by side, ready to face whatever would come. It was more than just a fight for survival. It was a fight for a future, for the chance to heal and to protect what they had built together. The men from Elsie's past had made it clear that they weren't leaving without her. The rancher had known it was coming, but nothing could prepare him for the intensity of the moment. The wind howled through the trees, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The boy, standing behind them, clutched the rancher's leg, his small face filled with fear. But there was something else there too, something stronger, something that made the rancher believe they could win. The boy was ready to stand beside them, just as much a part of the fight as anyone. The first blow came faster than expected, a man lunging toward Elsie, knife in hand. The rancher acted without thinking, grabbing the rifle that was always within reach and firing a shot that echoed through the valley. The man went down, but the others didn't hesitate. They charged, their eyes burning with anger and desperation. Elsie, who had once been the one to run, was now standing firm. The fear in her eyes was gone, replaced with a quiet resolve. She was done running. As one of the men came at her, she dodged to the side, grabbing a nearby branch to defend herself. Her movements were swift, but the weight of her past hung heavy on her shoulders. Each swing of the branch, each movement she made, was a step toward facing the demons that had chased her for so long. The rancher didn't hesitate. He stood beside her, rifle raised, determined to protect the boy and the life they had started to build. The men were relentless, but the rancher and Elsie fought with everything they had. The boy watched from behind them, his small form crouched down, eyes wide with fear, but also with something else, something new. Hope. He was beginning to understand what it meant to stand and fight for the people you loved. The rancher's heart pounded in his chest as he fired another shot, bringing down one of the attackers. The man let out a shout of frustration before crumpling to the ground. The remaining two men hesitated, their faces filled with doubt. It was clear they hadn't expected the rancher and Elsie to fight back so fiercely. The rancher's voice was steady, but filled with authority. "You should have turned around when you had the chance," he called out, aiming the rifle at the remaining men. "This ends here." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The men exchanged a quick glance, weighing their options. And then, just as quickly, they turned and fled. They hadn't come for a fight, but for something they thought they could take. And in that moment, they realized that they couldn't take anything from Elsie anymore. The danger had passed. The rancher lowered his rifle, watching as the men disappeared into the distance. He turned to Elsie, his heart still racing, but a sense of relief beginning to settle in. She stood beside him, her breath heavy, but her eyes clear. She was no longer the woman who had been running from her past. She was no longer hiding. Elsie looked at the rancher, her voice softer now, yet filled with conviction. "I'm done running," she said, her words steady and final. "This is where I belong." The rancher nodded, understanding what she meant. He had seen it in her eyes the moment she stood her ground against those men. She had finally faced what she had been avoiding for so long. It was a decision that was both empowering and painful, but it was one that would allow her to finally find peace. "I'm glad you're staying," the rancher said quietly, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "We're safer now, but more than that, we're together." Elsie smiled, the weight of the years that had passed lifting slightly from her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. She had faced her past, and in doing so, she had found a new beginning. The boy, who had watched the entire confrontation from behind him, finally stood up, his eyes wide with relief. He ran toward Elsie, his arms outstretched. "Mama," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'm not scared anymore." Elsie knelt down and pulled him into her arms, the boy's small body pressed against hers. She kissed his forehead, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. They had made it through the storm, and now they were finally free. The rancher watched the boy and Elsie, a quiet contentment spreading through him. The cabin, once a place of silence and uncertainty, was now full of warmth and laughter. The boy had begun to call Elsie Mama again, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice. He had finally found a place where he belonged, with a woman who had become the mother he needed, and a man who had become the father he had been missing. The rancher felt a quiet pride in his chest as he watched the family he had helped create. They had been through so much pain, fear, and loss, but now they had come out on the other side stronger. The love they had found, despite all the odds, was something that could never be broken. Elsie stood by the window, her hands resting on the sill as she gazed out at the land they had come to call home. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. The rancher joined her, standing beside her as they both looked out at the vastness of the world around them. "We've made it through," Elsie said softly, her voice filled with wonder. "I never thought I would find peace again, but here I am." The rancher looked at her, his heart full. "We've all made it through," he said, his voice steady. Together, the boy, who had been playing outside, came running up to them. "Papa, Mama," he called, his face lit up with a smile. "Come play with me." Elsie smiled and reached out for his hand. "In a minute, sweetheart. We just need a moment." As the rancher and Elsie stood there, side by side, they both knew that this was the beginning of something new. They had faced their past, survived the storm, and now they could build a future. A future filled with love, trust, and the strength to overcome whatever might come next. And as they walked outside to join the boy, the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the land. For the first time in years, the rancher felt truly at peace. His family was whole, and their journey, though far from over, had just begun.